Here's how you can self-prepare for the GMAT. I took the GMAT multiple times, got a score more than 700, had GMAT tutors, but there was really one thing that I've learned from all my GMAT tutors about how you can self-prepare for the GMAT and ace it. Ultimately, of course, tutors and guidance is always helpful. But if you're one of those people who's studying for the GMAT by yourself over a span of a few weeks, here's how you can prepare for the GMAT all by yourself. There's 4 pillars to preparing for the GMAT by yourself: accuracy, having an error log, having concept revision, and finally stress and timing. Whenever you're trying to ace the GMAT, the first thing that you need to do is get 100% accuracy. Now that sounds like doable because if you do, just 2 or 3 questions, chances are you would probably get those questions right. But the moment you start doing 20 or 30 questions, you will understand and realize and see a pattern of how you're probably missing out 7, 8, or even 11 questions. That is not good because we think in percentage terms that, if I'm getting 65% of the questions right, I'm a great GMAT test taker. But the GMAT is not testing your skills on whether you're able to get the questions that everybody else can get right. What the GMAT is testing is whether those questions, which are the really tricky ones, which most people tend to get wrong, whether you yourself are getting those questions right. And so focusing on accuracy first, above all, anything is the number one thing you need to do whenever you're studying for the GMAT all by yourself. It sounds difficult, or rather it sounds easy, but it's very difficult to do in practice. Why? Because we're used to having more and more and easier access to how we are performing, and that effectively boils down to having quick feedback loops. But accuracy takes away those quick feedback loops and forces you to sit with why you made a mistake first. Which brings me to the second point: you need to have an error log. Whenever I would solve GMAT exam questions or go to GMAT club and just focus on one particular skill and just try to master that and do that for weeks, if not months, I realized that there was one pattern that I was falling into, which is that either I would get questions of X type in reading comprehension wrong, or I would get certain grammar questions in sentence correction wrong. And of course, the GMAT has changed since then. But what I've realized is that focusing on those weak points by recording which exact questions you got wrong and then really writing down why you got those questions wrong is a very important component to your GMAT journey. Creating an error log forces constraints on you. It tells you and shows you that this is exactly how you've gone wrong and this is exactly what you should and should not be doing. And that requires thinking. And thinking is hard, which is exactly we don't think of creating an error log. I remember I created an error log months into my GMAT preparation. Perhaps I should have started earlier. It would have caused all my GMAT prep to be much easier, simpler, and less stress. The third thing that I've really noticed in acing the GMAT when you're studying by yourself is concept revision. You see, the third thing after we have nailed accuracy, we have created an error log, and we are diagnostically evaluating our strengths and weaknesses. The third thing that really matters then is whether you can abstract those specific errors to a higher level and abstract them away to specific concepts that you need to learn. Perhaps it is a set of sentence correction or reading comprehension questions that are not really related, but somehow you see a string or a set of common threads weaved beyond sections or within sections that you need to practice. And then what you need to do is to isolate that particular thread and really double down on it. Really double down on what you're lacking in, what you're strong at, honing those strengths and building those weaknesses. And which is why I think the third pillar of concept revision is a critical thing. You just can't be studying for the GMAT as if it's a general or generic thing that you're doing. It's not textbook learning. It's not a test of aptitude. It's a test of stress. It's a test of whether you can persevere. It's a test of you realizing whether you can match up to what the test is demanding and asking for, which is whether you can meet spec, whether you can meet specifications. And I like this definition in particular because Seth Godin often talks about what is quality. Quality is whether you can meet spec, whether you can meet the specifications of a client, or in this case, of GMAT. So revising your concepts after you have isolated them through an error log by first having focused on accuracy is the third very critical component of studying for the GMAT yourself. And lastly, what you need to do is to replicate the stress and timing components in your GMAT questions. You see, once you have been able to isolate what you're good at, what you're not good at, really focus, double down on the kinds of concepts that you need to be thinking about and practicing, and you actually do that, having looked at your error log and having looked at all the concepts, the last thing that is pending is whether you can replicate the stress. Because you see, all of these things only come into play on test day, and they will be tested in varying proportions amid a stressful period. Because suddenly you have only X hours to finish your GMAT exam and put in everything that you have prepared for behind one single question. And that is a very important factor, because oftentimes we perform differently in stress than we do when we're not stressed. But having this journey and having this clarity that first you have to actively eliminate any ounce of stress in your GMAT preparation, which is why you need to focus on accuracy, error log, and concept provision, and then consciously add that element of stress, because only then are you able to isolate variables and run an experiment on what happens when you re-add that variable. So I think preparing for the GMAT by yourself is a lot like a scientific experiment, where you're constantly isolating things that don't matter first, perfecting that art, and then reintroducing a variable that may switch or change the context in one direction or the other, and then re-evaluating the whole preparation from that revolved and new prism. And that is how you can really understand and strategically approach the whole GMAT journey. I wish I was able to have found this kind of advice or just guidance in general when I was preparing for my GMAT, because I remember having looked at tons of YouTube videos, but all of them were very, very tactical. And I wasn't able to really find a more higher 30,000 feet level video or content as to what should be the mindset when you're preparing for the GMAT. Share this with somebody who's studying for their standardized tests or who's suffering from test anxiety.